Aristotle, Nicomachean Ethics, translated by W. D. Ross. Book 1, Section 1. Every art and every inquiry, and similarly every action and pursuit, is thought to aim at some good. And for this reason, the good has rightly been declared to be that at which all things aim. But a certain difference is found among ends. Some are activities, others are products apart from the activities that produce them. Where there are ends apart from the actions, it is the nature of the products to be better than the activities. Now, as there are many actions, arts, and sciences, their ends also are many. The end of the medical art is health, that of shipbuilding a vessel, that of strategy victory, that of economics wealth. But where such arts fall under a single capacity, as bridle making and the other arts concerned with the equipment of horses fall under the art of riding, and this in every military action under strategy, in the same way other arts fall under yet others. In all of these, the ends of the master arts are to be preferred to all the subordinate ends, for it is for the sake of the former that the latter are pursued. It makes no difference whether the activities themselves are the ends of the action, or just something else apart from the activities, as in the case of the sciences just mentioned. Section 2. If, then, there is some end of the things we do, which we desire for its own sake, everything else being desired for the sake of this, and if we do not choose everything for the sake of something else, for at that rate the process would go on to infinity, so that our desire would be empty and vain. Clearly, this must be the good, and the chief good. Will not the knowledge of it, then, have great influence on life? Shall we not, like archers who have a mark to aim at, be more likely to hit upon what is right? If so, we must try, in outline at least, to determine what it is, and of which of the sciences or capacities it is the object. It would seem to belong to the most authoritative art, and that which is most truly the master art. And politics appears to be of this nature, for it is this that ordains which of the sciences should be studied in a state, and which each class of citizens should learn, and up to what point they should learn them. And we see even the most highly esteemed of capacities to fall under this. For example, strategy, economics, rhetoric. Now, since politics uses the rest of the sciences, and since, again, it legislates as to what we are to do and what we are to abstain from, the end of this science must include those of the others, so that this end must be the good for man. For even if the end is the same for a single man and for a state, that of the state seems at all events something greater and more complete whether to attain or to preserve. Though it is worthwhile to attain the end merely for one man, it is finer and more godlike to attain it for a nation or for city-states. These, then, are the ends at which our inquiry aims, since it is political science in one sense of that term. Section 3. Our discussion will be adequate if it has as much clearness as the subject matter admits of, for precision is not to be sought for alike in all discussions, any more than in all the products of the crafts. Now fine and just actions, which political science investigates, admit of much variety and fluctuation of opinion, so that they may be thought to exist only by convention and not by nature. And goods also give rise to a similar fluctuation because they bring harm to many people. For before now, men have been undone by reason of their wealth, and others by reason of their courage. We must be content, then, in speaking of such subjects, and with such premises, to indicate the truth roughly and in outline, and in speaking about things which are only for the most part true, and with premises of the same kind to reach conclusions that are no better. In the same spirit, therefore, should each type of statement be received. For it is the mark of an educated man to look for precision in each class of things, just so far as the nature of the subject admits. It is evidently equally foolish to accept probable reasoning from a mathematician and to demand from a rhetorician scientific proofs. Now each man judges well the things he knows, and of these he is a good judge. And so the man who has been educated in a subject is a good judge of that subject, and the man who has received an all-round education is a good judge in general. Hence, a young man is not a proper hearer of lectures on political science, for he is inexperienced in the actions that occur in life. But its discussions start from these and are about these. And further, since he tends to follow his passions, his study will be vain and unprofitable, because the end aimed at is not knowledge, but action. And it makes no difference whether he is young in years or youthful in character. The defect does not depend on time, but on his living, and pursuing each successive object, as passion directs. For to such persons, as to the incontinent, knowledge brings no profit. But to those who desire and act in accordance with a rational principle, knowledge about such matters will be of great benefit. These remarks about the student, the sort of treatment to be expected, and the purpose of the inquiry, may be taken as our preface. Section 4. Let us resume our inquiry and state, in view of the fact that all knowledge and every pursuit aims at some good, what it is that we say political science aims at, and what is the highest of all goods achievable by action. Verbally, there is very general agreement. For both the general run of men and people of superior refinement say that it is happiness, and identify living well and doing well with being happy. But with regard to what happiness is, they differ, and the many do not give the same account as the wise. For the former think it is some plain and obvious thing, like pleasure, wealth, or honor. They differ, however, from one another, and often even the same man identifies it with different things. With health when he is ill, with wealth when he is poor. But, conscious of their ignorance, they admire those who proclaim some great ideal that it is above their comprehension. Now some thought that, apart from these many goods, there is another which is self-subsistent and causes the goodness of all these as well. To examine all the opinions that have been held were perhaps somewhat fruitless, enough to examine those that are most prevalent, or that seem to be arguable. Let us not fail to notice, however, that there is a difference between arguments from and those to the first principles. For Plato, too, was right in raising this question and asking, as he used to do, are we on the way from or to the first principles? There is a difference, as there is in a race course, between the course from the judges to the turning point and the way back. For, while we must begin with what is known, things are objects of knowledge in two senses, some to us, some without qualification. Presumably, then, we must begin with things known to us. Hence, anyone who is to listen intelligently to lectures about what is noble and just, and generally about the subjects of political science, must have been brought up in good habits. For the fact is the starting point, and if this is sufficiently plain to him, he will not at the start need the reason as well. And the man who has been well brought up has or can easily get starting points. And as for him who neither has nor can get them, let him hear the words of Hesiod. Far best is he who knows all things himself. Good he that hearkens when men counsel right. But he who neither knows nor lays to heart another's wisdom is a useless wight. Section 5. Let us, however, resume our discussion from the point at which we digressed. To judge from the lives that men lead, most men, and men of the most vulgar type, seem, not without some ground, to identify the good or happiness with pleasure, which is the reason why they love the life of enjoyment. For there are, we may say, three prominent types of life: that just mentioned, the political, and thirdly, the contemplative life. Now, the mass of mankind are evidently quite slavish in their tastes, preferring a life suitable to beasts. But they get some ground for their view from the fact that many of those in high places share the tastes of Sardanapalus. A consideration of the prominent types of life shows that people of superior refinement and of active disposition identify happiness with honor. For this is, roughly speaking, the end of the political life. But it seems too superficial to be what we are looking for, since it is thought to depend on those who bestow honor rather than on him who receives it. But the good we divine to be something proper to a man and not easily taken from him. Further, men seem to pursue honor in order that they may be assured of their goodness. At least it is by men of practical wisdom that they seek to be honored, and among those who know them, and on the ground of their virtue. Clearly then, according to them, at any rate, virtue is better. And perhaps one might even suppose this to be, rather than honor, the end of the political life. But even this appears somewhat incomplete, for possession of virtue seems actually compatible with being asleep, or with lifelong inactivity, and further with the greatest sufferings and misfortune. But a man who is living so no one would call happy, unless he were maintaining a thesis at all costs. But enough of this, for the subject has been sufficiently treated even in the current discussion. Third comes the contemplative life, which we shall consider later. The life of money-making is one undertaken under compulsion, and wealth is evidently not the good we are seeking, for it is merely useful and for the sake of something else. And so one might rather take the aforenamed objects to be ends, for they are loved for themselves. But it is evident that not even these are ends. Yet many arguments have been thrown away in support of them. Let us leave this subject, then. Section 6. We had perhaps better consider the universal good and discuss thoroughly what is meant by it, although such an inquiry is made an uphill one by the fact that the forms have been introduced by friends of our own. Yet it would perhaps be thought to be better, indeed to be our duty, for the sake of maintaining the truth, even to destroy what touches us closely, especially as we are philosophers or lovers of wisdom. For, while both are dear, piety requires us to honor truth above our friends. The men who introduced this doctrine did not posit ideas of classes within which they recognize priority and posteriority, which is the reason why they did not maintain the existence of an idea embracing all numbers. But the term good is used both in the category of substance and in that of quality and in that of relation, and that which is per se. In other words, substance is prior in nature to the relative, for the latter is like an offshoot and accident of being, so that there could not be a common idea set over all these goods. Further, since good has as many senses as being, for it is predicated both in the category of substance, as of God and of reason, and in quality, in other words, of the virtues, and in quantity, in other words, of that which is moderate, and in relation, in other words, of the useful, and in time, in other words, of the right opportunity, and in place, in other words, of the right locality, and the like. Clearly, it cannot be something universally present in all cases and single, for then it could not have been predicated in all the categories, but in one only. Further, since of the things answering to one idea there is one science, there would have been one science of all the goods. But as it is, there are many sciences, even of the things that fall under one category. For example, of opportunity, for opportunity in war is studied by strategics, and in disease by medicine. And the moderate in food is studied by medicine, and in exercise by the science of gymnastics. And one might ask the question, what in the world they mean by a thing itself? As is the case, in man himself, and in a particular man, the account of man is one and the same. For insofar as they are man, they will in no respect differ. And if this is so, neither will good itself and particular goods, insofar as they are good. But again, it will not be good any the more for being eternal, since that which lasts long is no whiter than that which perishes in a day. The Pythagoreans seem to give a more plausible account of the good, when they place the one in the column of goods, and it is they that Speusippus seems to have followed. But let us discuss these matters elsewhere. An objection to what we have said, however, may be discerned in the fact that the Platonists have not been speaking about all goods, and that the goods that are pursued and loved for themselves are called good by reference to a single form, while those which tend to produce or to preserve these somehow, or to prevent their contraries, are called so by reference to these, and in a secondary sense. Clearly, then, goods must be spoken of in two ways, and some must be good in themselves, the others by reason of these. Let us separate, then, things good in themselves from things useful, and consider whether the former are called good by reference to a single idea. What sort of goods would one call good in themselves? Is it those that are pursued even when isolated from others, such as intelligence, sight, and certain pleasures and honors? Certainly, if we pursue these also for the sake of something else, yet one would place them among things good in themselves. Or is nothing other than the idea of good good in itself? In that case, the form will be empty. But if the things we have named are also things good in themselves, the account of the good will have to appear as something identical in them all, as that of whiteness is identical in snow and in white lead. But of honor, wisdom, and pleasure, just in respect of their goodness, the accounts are distinct and diverse. The good, therefore, is not some common element answering to one idea. But what, then, do we mean by the good? It is surely not like the things that only chance to have the same name. Are goods one, then, by being derived from one good, or by all contributing to one good, or are they rather one by analogy? Certainly, as sight is in the body, so is reason in the soul, and so on in other cases. But perhaps these subjects had better be dismissed for the present, for perfect precision about them would be more appropriate to another branch of philosophy. And similarly, with regard to the idea, even if there is some one good which is universally predicable of goods, or is capable of separate and independent existence, clearly it could not be achieved or attained by man. But we are now seeking something attainable. Perhaps, however, someone might think it worthwhile to recognize this with a view to the goods that are attainable and achievable. For having this as a sort of pattern, we shall know better the goods that are good for us, and if we know them, shall attain them. This argument has some plausibility, but seems to clash with the procedure of the sciences. For all of these, though they aim at some good and seek to supply the deficiency of it, leave on one side the knowledge of the good. Yet that all the exponents of the arts should be ignorant of, and should not even seek, so great an aid is not probable. It is hard, too, to see how a weaver or a carpenter will be benefited in regard to his own craft by knowing this good itself, or how the man who has viewed the idea itself will be a better doctor or general thereby. For a doctor seems not even to study health in this way, but the health of man, or perhaps, rather, the health of a particular man. It is individuals that he is healing. But enough of these topics. Section 7. Let us return again to the good we are seeking, and ask what it can be. It seems different in different actions and arts. It is different in medicine, in strategy, and in the other arts likewise. What then is the good of each? Surely that for whose sake everything else is done. In medicine, this is health. In strategy, victory. In architecture, a house. In any other sphere, something else. And in every action and pursuit, the end. For it is for the sake of this that all men do whatever else they do. Therefore, if there is an end for all that we do, this will be the good achievable by action. And if there are more than one, these will be the goods achievable by action. So the argument has by a different course reached the same point, but we must try to state this even more clearly. Since there are evidently more than one end, and we choose some of these, for example wealth, flutes, and in general instruments, for the sake of something else, clearly not all ends are final ends. But the chief good is evidently something final. Therefore, if there is only one final end, this will be what we are seeking. And if there are more than one, the most final of these will be what we are seeking. Now we call that which is in itself worthy of pursuit more final than that which is worthy of pursuit for the sake of something else, and that which is never desirable for the sake of something else more final than the things that are desirable both in themselves and for the sake of that other thing. And therefore we call final without qualification that which is always desirable in itself and never for the sake of something else. Now such a thing happiness, above all else, is held to be. For this we choose always for self and never for the sake of something else. But honor, pleasure, reason, and every virtue we should indeed for themselves. For if nothing resulted from them, we should still choose each of them. But we choose them also for the sake of happiness, judging that by means of them we shall be happy. Happiness, on the other hand, no one chooses for the sake of these, nor in general for anything other than itself. From the point of view of self-sufficiency, the same result seems to follow. For the final good is thought to be self-sufficient. Now, by self-sufficient, we do not mean that which is sufficient for a man by himself, for one who lives a solitary life, but also for parents, children, wife, and in general for his friends and fellow citizens, since man is born for citizenship. But some limit must be set to this, for if we extend our requirement to ancestors and descendants and friends' friends, we are in for an infinite series. Let us examine this question, however, on another occasion. The self-sufficient we now define as that which, when isolated, makes life desirable and lacking in nothing. And such we think happiness to be. And further, we think it most desirable of all things, without being counted as one good thing among others. If it were so counted, it would clearly be made more desirable by the addition of even the least of goods. For that which is added becomes in excess of goods, and of goods the greater is always more desirable. Happiness, then, is something final and self-sufficient, and is the end of action. Presumably, however, to say that happiness is the chief good seems a platitude, and a clearer account of what it is still desired. This might perhaps be given if we could first ascertain the function of man. For just as for a flute player, a sculptor, or an artist, and in general for all things that have a function or activity, the good and the well is thought to reside in the function, so it would seem to be for man, if he has a function. Have the carpenter, then, and the tanner certain functions or activities, and has the man none? Is he born without a function? Or as eye, hand, foot, and in general each of the parts evidently has a function, may one lay it down that man similarly has a function apart from all these? What then can this be? Life seems to be common even to plants, but we are seeking what is particular to man. Let us exclude, therefore, the life of nutrition and growth. Next, there would be a life of perception, but it also seems to be common even to the horse, the ox, and every animal. There remains, then, an active life of the element that has a rational principle. Of this, one part has such a principle in the sense of being obedient to one, the other in the sense of possessing one and exercising thought. And, as life of the rational element also has two meanings, we must state that life in the sense of activity is what we mean, for this seems to be the more proper sense of the term. Now, if the function of man is an activity of soul which follows or implies a rational principle, and if we say so and a good so and so have a function which is the same in kind, for example a liar and a good lyre player, and so without qualification in all cases, eminence in respect of goodness being added to the name of the function. For the function of a lyre player is to play the lyre, and that of a good lyre player is to do so well. If this is the case, and we state the function of man to be a certain kind of life, and this to be an activity or actions of the soul implying a rational principle, and the function of a good man to be the good and noble performance of these, and if any action is well performed when it is performed in accordance with the appropriate excellence, if this is the case, human good turns out to be activity of soul in accordance with virtue, and if there are more than one virtue, in accordance with the best and most complete. But we must add, in a complete light, for one swallow does not make a summer, nor does one day. And so too one day or a short time does not make a man blessed and happy. Let this serve as an outline of the good, for we must presumably first sketch it roughly, and then later fill in the detail. But it would seem that anyone is capable of carrying on and articulating what has once been well outlined, and that time is a good discoverer or partner in such a work, to which facts the advances of the arts are due, for any one can add what is lacking. And we must also remember what has been said before, and not look for precision in all things alike, but in each class of things such precision as accords with the subject matter, and so much as is appropriate to the inquiry. For a carpenter and a geometer investigate the right angle in different ways. The former does so insofar as the right angle is useful for his work, while the latter inquires what it is or what sort of thing it is, for he is a spectator of the truth. We must act in the same way, then, in all other matters as well, that our main task may not be subordinated to minor questions. Nor must we demand the cause in all matters alike. It is enough in some cases that the fact be well established, as in the case of the first principles. The fact is the primary thing, or first principle. Now of first principles, we see some by induction, some by perception, some by a certain habituation, and others too in other ways. But each set of principles we must try to investigate in the natural way, and we must take pains to state them definitely, since they have a great influence on what follows. For the beginning is thought to be more than half of the whole, and many of the questions we ask are cleared up by it. Section 8. We must consider it, however, in the light not only of our conclusion and our premises, but also of what is commonly said about it. For with a true view all the data harmonize, but with a false one the facts soon clash. Now goods have been divided into three classes, and some are described as external, others as relating to soul or to body. We call those that relate to soul most properly and truly goods, and psychical actions and activities we class as relating to the soul. Therefore, our account must be sound, at least according to this view, which is an old one and agreed on by philosophers. It is correct also in that we identify the end with certain actions and activities, for thus it falls among the goods of the soul and not among external goods. Another belief which harmonizes with our account is that the happy man lives well and does well, for we have practically defined happiness as a sort of good life and good action. The characteristics that are looked for in happiness seem also, all of them, to belong to what we have defined happiness as being. For some identify happiness with virtue, some with practical wisdom, others with a kind of philosophic wisdom, others with these or one of these accompanied by pleasure or not without pleasure, while others include also external prosperity. Now some of these views have been held by many men and men of old, others by a few eminent persons, and it is not probable that either of these should be entirely mistaken, but rather that they should be right in at least some one respect or even in most respects. With those who identify happiness with virtue, or some one virtue, our account is in harmony. For to virtue belongs virtuous activity. But it makes perhaps no small difference whether we place the chief good in possession or in use, in state of mind or in activity. For the state of mind may exist without producing any good result, as in a man who is asleep or in some other way quite inactive, but the activity cannot. For one who has the activity will of necessity be acting, and acting well. And as in the Olympic Games, it is not the most beautiful and the strongest that are crowned, but those who compete. For it is some of these that are victorious. So those who act win, and rightly win, the noble and good things in life. Their life is also in itself pleasant, For pleasure is a state of soul, and to each man that which he is said to be a lover of is pleasant. For example, not only is a horse pleasant to the lover of horses, and a spectacle to the lover of sights, but also in the same way just acts are pleasant to the lover of justice, and in general virtuous acts to the lover of virtue. Now for most men their pleasures are in conflict with one another, because these are not by nature pleasant, but the lovers of what is noble find pleasant the things that are by nature pleasant. And virtuous actions are such, so that these are pleasant for such men, as well as in their own nature. Their life, therefore, has no further need of pleasure as a sort of adventitious charm, but has its pleasure in itself. For, besides what we have said, the man who does not rejoice in noble actions is not even good, since no one would call a man just who did not enjoy acting justly, nor any man liberal who did not enjoy liberal actions, and similarly in all other cases. If this is so, virtuous actions must be in themselves pleasant. But they are also good and noble, and have each of these attributes in the highest degree. Since the good man judges well about these attributes, his judgment is such as we have described. Happiness, then, is the best, noblest, and most pleasant thing in the world, and these attributes are not severed, as in the inscription at Delos. Most noble is that which is justice, and best is health, but pleasantest is it to win what we love. For all these properties belong to the best activities, and these, or one, the best of these, we identify with happiness. Yet evidently, as we said, it needs the external goods as well, for it is impossible or not easy to do noble acts without the proper equipment. In many actions we used friends and riches and political power as instruments, and there are some things the lack of which takes the luster from happiness, as good birth, goodly children, beauty. For the man who is very ugly in appearance, or ill-born, or solitary, and childless, is not very likely to be happy. And perhaps a man would be still less likely if he had thoroughly bad children or friends, or had lost good children or friends by death. As we've said then, happiness seems to need this sort of prosperity in addition. For which reason some identify happiness with good fortune, though others identify it with virtue. Section 9. For this reason also the question is asked, whether happiness is to be acquired by learning or by habituation, or some other sort of training, or comes in virtue of some divine providence, or again by chance. Now, if there is any gift of the gods to men, it is reasonable that happiness should be God-given, and most surely God-given of all human things inasmuch as it is the best. But this question would perhaps be more appropriate to another inquiry. Happiness seems, however, even if it is not God-sent, but comes as a result of virtue, and some process of learning or training, to be among the most godlike things. For that which is the prize and end of virtue seems to be the best thing in the world, and something godlike and blessed. It will also, on this view, be very generally shared, for all who are not maimed as regards their potentiality for virtue may win it by a certain kind of study and care. But if it is better to be happy thus than by chance, it is reasonable that the facts should be so, since everything that depends on the action of nature is by nature as good as it can be, and similarly, everything that depends on art or any rational cause, and especially if it depends on the best of all causes. To entrust to chance what is greatest and most noble would be a very defective arrangement. The answer to the question we are asking is plain also from the definition of happiness. For it has been said to be a virtuous activity of soul of a certain kind. Of the remaining goods, some must necessarily pre-exist as conditions of happiness, and others are naturally cooperative and useful as instruments. And this will be found to agree with what we said at the outset, for we stated the end of political science to be the best end, and political science spends most of its pains on making the citizens to be of a certain character, vis-a-vis good and capable of noble acts. It is natural, then, that we call neither ox nor horse nor any other of the animals happy, for none of them is capable of sharing in such activity. For this reason, also, a boy is not happy, for he is not yet capable of such acts, owing to his age. And boys who are called happy are being congratulated by reason of the hopes we have for them. For there is required, as we said, not only complete virtue, but also a complete life, since many changes occur in life, and all matter of chances, and the most prosperous may fall into great misfortunes in old age, as is told of Priam in the Trojan cycle, and one who has experienced such chances and has ended wretchedly no one calls happy. Section 10. Must no one at all, then, be called happy while he lives? Must we, as Solon says, see the end? Even if we are to lay down this doctrine, is it also the case that a man is happy when he is dead? Or is not this quite absurd, especially for us who say that happiness is an activity? But if we do not call the dead man happy, and if Solon does not mean this, but that one can then safely call a man blessed as being at last beyond evils and misfortunes, this also affords matter for discussion. For both evil and good are thought to exist for a dead man, as much as for one who is alive but not aware of them. For example, honors and dishonors, and the good or bad fortunes of children, and in general of descendants. And this also presents a problem, for though a man has lived happily up to old age, and has had a death worthy of his life, many reverses may befall his descendants. Some of them may be good and attain the life they deserve, while with others the opposite may be the case. And clearly, too, the degrees of relationship between them and their ancestors may vary indefinitely. It would be odd, then, if the dead man were to share in these changes and become at one time happy, at another wretched. While it would also be odd if the fortunes of the descendants did not, for some reason, have some effect on the happiness of the ancestors. But we must return to our first difficulty, for perhaps by a consideration of it our present problem might be solved. Now, if we must see the end and only then call a man happy, not as being happy but as having been so before, surely this is a paradox, that when he is happy, the attribute that belongs to him is not to be truly predicated of him, because we do not wish to call living men happy, on account of the changes that may befall them, and because we have assumed happiness to be something permanent and by no means easily changed, while a single man may suffer many turns of fortune's wheel. For clearly, if we were to keep pace with his fortunes, we should often call the same man happy and again wretched, making the happy man out to be chameleon and insecurely based. Or is this keeping pace with his fortunes quite wrong? Success or failure in life does not depend on these, but human life, as we said, needs these as mere additions, while virtuous activities, or their opposites, are what constitute happiness or the reverse. The question we have now discussed confirms our definition. For no function of man has so much permanence as virtuous activities. These are thought to be more durable even than knowledge of the sciences. And of these themselves, the most valuable are more durable, because those who are happy spend their life most readily and most continuously in these. For this seems to be the reason why we do not forget them. The attribute in question, then, will belong to the happy man, and he will be happy throughout his life. For always, or by preference to everything else, he will be engaged in virtuous action and contemplation. And he will bear the chances of life most nobly and altogether decorously, if he is truly good and foursquare beyond reproach. Now many events happen by chance, and events differing in importance. Small pieces of good fortune, or of its opposite, clearly do not weigh down the scales of life one way or the other, but a multitude of great events, if they turn out well, will make life happier. For not only are they themselves such as to add beauty to life, but the way a man deals with them may be noble and good, while if they turn out ill, they crush and maim happiness. For they both bring pain with them and hinder many activities. Yet even in these, nobility shines through, when a man bears with resignation many great misfortunes, not through insensibility to pain, but through nobility and greatness of soul. If activities are, as we said, what gives life its character, no happy man can become miserable, for he will never do the acts that are hateful and mean. For the man who is truly good and wise, we think, bears all the chances life becomingly, and always makes the best of circumstances, as a good general makes the best military use of the army at his command, and a good shoemaker makes the best shoes out of the hides that are given him, and so with all other craftsmen. And if this is the case, the happy man can never become miserable, though he will not reach blessedness if he meet with fortunes like those of Priam. Nor again is he many-colored and changeable, for neither will he be moved from his happy state easily or by any ordinary misadventures, but only by many great ones, nor, if he has had many great misadventures, will he recover his happiness in a short time, but if at all, only in a long and complete one in which he has attained many splendid successes. When then should we not say that he is happy who is active in accordance with complete virtue and is sufficiently equipped with external goods, not for some chance period, but throughout a complete life? Or must we add, and who is destined to live thus and die as befits his life? Certainly the future is obscure to us, while happiness, we claim, is an end and something in every way final. If so, we shall call happy those among living men in whom these conditions are and are to be fulfilled, but happy men. So much for these questions. Section 11. That the fortunes of descendants and of all a man's friends should not affect his happiness at all seems a very unfriendly doctrine, and one opposed to the opinions men hold. But since the events that happen are numerous and a bit of all sorts of difference, and some come more near to us and others less so, it seems a long, nay, an infinite task to discuss each in detail. A general outline will perhaps suffice. If then, as some of a man's own misadventures have a certain weight and influence on life while others are, as it were, lighter, so too there are differences among the misadventures of our friends taken as a whole. And it makes a difference whether the various suffering befall the living or the dead, much more even than whether lawless and terrible deeds are presupposed in a tragedy or done on the stage. This difference also must be taken into account. Or rather, perhaps, the fact that doubt is felt whether the dead share in any good or evil. For it seems, from these considerations, that even if anything, whether good or evil, penetrates to them, it must be something weak and negligible, either in itself or for them. Or if not, at least it must be such in degree and kind as not to make happy those who are not happy, nor to take away their blessedness from those who are. The good or bad fortunes of friends, then, seem to have some effects on the dead, but effects of such a kind and degree as neither to make the happy unhappy, nor to produce any other change of the kind. Section 12. These questions having been definitely answered, let us consider whether happiness is among the things that are praised, or rather among the things that are prized. For clearly it is not to be placed among potentialities. Everything that is praised seems to be praised because it is of a certain kind and is related somehow to something else. For we praised the just or brave man, and in general both the good man and virtue itself, because of the actions and functions involved. And we praise the strong man, the good runner, and so on, because he is of a certain kind and is related in a certain way to something good and important. This is clear also from the praises of the gods, for it seems absurd that the gods should be referred to our standard. But this is done because praise involves a reference to something else. But if praise is for things such as we have described, clearly what applies to the best things is not praise, but something greater and better, as is indeed obvious. For what we do to the gods and the most godlike of men is to call them blessed and happy. And so too with good things. No one praises happiness as he does justice, but rather calls it blessed, as being something more divine and better. Eudoxus also seems to have been right in his method of advocating the supremacy of pleasure. He thought that the fact that, though a good, it is not praised indicated it to be better than the things that are praised, and that this is what God and the good are, for by reference to these all other things are judged. Praise is appropriate to virtue, for as a result of virtue, men tend to do noble deeds, but encomia are bestowed on acts, whether of the body or of the soul. But perhaps nicety in these matters is more proper to those who have made a study of encomia. To us it is clear from what has been said that happiness is among the things that are prized and perfect. It seems to be so also from the fact that it is a first principle, for it is for the sake of this that we all do all that we do, and the first principle and cause of goods is, we claim, something prized and divine. Section 13. Since happiness is an activity of soul, in accordance with perfect virtue, we must consider the nature of virtue, for perhaps we shall thus see better the nature of happiness. The true student of politics, too, is thought to have studied virtue above all things, for he wishes to make his fellow citizens good and obedient to the laws. As an example of this, we have the lawgivers of the Cretans and the Spartans, and any others of the kind that there may have been. And if this inquiry belongs to political science, clearly the pursuit of it will be in accordance with our original plan. But clearly the virtue we must study is human virtue, for the good we were seeking was human good, and the happiness human happiness. By human virtue, we mean not that of the body, but that of the soul. And happiness we also call an activity of the soul. But if this is so, clearly the student of politics must know somehow the facts about soul, as the man who is to heal the eyes or the body as a whole must know about the eyes or the body. And all the more since politics is more prized and better than medicine. But even among doctors, the best educated spend much labor on acquiring knowledge of the body. The student of politics, then, must study the soul, and study it with these objects in view, and do so just to the extent which is sufficient for the questions we are discussing. For further precision is perhaps something more laborious than our purposes require. Some things are said about it adequately enough, even in the discussions outside our school, and we must use these, for example, that one element in the soul is irrational and one has a rational principle. Whether these are separated as the parts of the body or of anything divisible are distinct by definition, but by nature inseparable, like convex and concave in the circumference of a circle, does not affect the present question. Of the irrational element, one division seems to be widely distributed and vegetative in its nature. I mean that which causes nutrition and growth. For it is this kind of power of the soul that one must assign to all nurslings and to embryos, and this same power to full-grown creatures. This is more reasonable than to assign some different power to them. Now the excellence of this seems to be common to all species and not specifically human. For this part or faculty seems to function most in sleep, while goodness and badness are least manifest in sleep. Whence comes the saying that the happy are not better off than the wretched for half their lives. And this happens naturally enough, since sleep is an inactivity of the soul, and in that respect in which it is called good or bad. Unless perhaps to a small extent some of the movements actually penetrate to the soul, and in this respect the dreams of good men are better than those of ordinary people. Enough of this subject, however. Let us leave the nutritive faculty alone, since it has by nature no share in human excellence. There seems to be also another irrational element in the soul, one which is, in a sense, however, sharing in a rational principle. For we praise the rational principle of the continent man and of the incontinent, and the part of their soul that has such a principle, since it urges them aright and towards the best objects. But there is found in them also another element naturally opposed to the rational principle, which fights against and resists that principle. For exactly as paralyzed limbs, when we intend to move them to the right turn on the contrary to the left, so it is with the soul. The impulses of incontinent people move in contrary directions. But while in the body we see that which moves astray, in the soul we do not. No doubt, however, we must nonetheless suppose that in the soul too there is something contrary to the rational principle, resisting and opposing it. In what sense it is distinct from the other elements does not concern us. Now even this seems to have a share in a rational principle, as we said. At any rate, in the continent man, it obeys the rational principle, and presumably, in the temperate and brave man, it is still more obedient. For in him it speaks, on all matters, with the same voice as the rational principle. Therefore, the irrational element also appears to be twofold. For the vegetative element in no way shares in a rational principle, but the appetitive, and in general the desiring element, in a sense shares in it, insofar as it listens to and obeys it. This is the sense in which we speak of taking account of one's father or one's friends, not that in which we speak of accounting for a mathematical property. That the irrational element is in some sense persuaded by a rational principle is indicated also by the giving of advice and by all reproof and exhortation. And if this element also must be said to have a rational principle, that which has a rational principle, as well as that which has not, will be twofold, one subdivision having it in the strict sense and in itself, and the other having a tendency to obey as one does one's father. Virtue, too, is distinguished into kinds in accordance with this difference. For we say that some of the virtues are intellectual and others moral, philosophic wisdom and understanding and practical wisdom being intellectual, liberality and temperance moral. For in speaking about a man's character, we do not say that he is wise or has understanding, but that he is good-tempered or temperate. Yet we praise the wise man also with respect to his state of mind, and of states of mind we call those which merit praise virtues. Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Book 2. Section 1. Virtue, then, being of two kinds, intellectual and moral. Intellectual virtue, in the main, owes both its birth and its growth to teaching, for which reason it requires experience and time, while moral virtue comes about as a result of habit, whence also its name is one that is formed by a slight variation from the word ethos. From this it is also plain that none of the moral virtues arises in us by nature, for nothing that exists by nature can form a habit contrary to its nature. For instance, the stone which by nature moves downward cannot be habituated to move upwards, not even if one tries to train it by throwing it up 10,000 times. Nor can fire be habituated to move downwards, nor can anything else that by nature behaves in one way be trained to behave in another. Neither by nature, then, nor contrary to nature do the virtues arise in us. Rather, we are adapted by nature to receive them, and are made perfect by habit. Again, of all the things that come to us by nature, we first acquire the potentiality, and later exhibit the activity. This is plain in the case of the senses, for it was not by often seeing or often hearing that we got these senses, but on the contrary, we had them before we used them, and did not come to have them by using them. But the virtues we get by first exercising them, as also happens in the case of the arts as well. For the things we have to learn before we can do them, we learn by doing them. For example, men become builders by building, and lyre players by playing the lyre. So too, we become just by doing just acts, temperate by doing temperate acts, brave by doing brave acts. This is confirmed by what happens in states. For legislators make the citizens good by forming habits in them, and this is the wish of every legislator. And those who do not effect it miss their mark. And it is in this that a good constitution differs from a bad one. Again, it is from the same causes and by the same means that every virtue is both produced and destroyed, and similarly every art. For it is from playing the lyre that both good and bad lyre players are produced. And the corresponding statement is true of builders and of all the rest. Men will be good or bad builders as a result of building well or badly. For if this were not so, there would have been no need of a teacher, but all men would have been born good or bad at their craft. This, then, is the case with the virtues also. By doing the acts that we do in our transactions with other men, we become just or unjust. And by doing the acts that we do in the presence of danger, and being habituated to feel fear or confidence, we become brave or cowardly. The same is true of appetites and feelings of anger. Some men become temperate and good-tempered, others self-indulgent and irascible, by behaving in one way or the other in the appropriate circumstances. Thus, in one word, states of character arise out of like activities. This is why the activities we exhibit must be of a certain kind. It is because the states of character correspond to the differences between these. It makes no small difference, then, whether we form habits of one kind or of another from our very youth. It makes a very great difference, or rather all the difference. Section 2. Since, then, the present inquiry does not aim at theoretical knowledge like the others, for we are inquiring not in order to know what virtue is, but in order to become good, since otherwise our inquiry would have been of no use. We must examine the nature of actions, namely how we ought to do them, for these determine also the nature of the states of character that are produced, as we have said. Now, that we must act according to the right rule is a common principle and must be assumed. It will be discussed later. In other words, both what the right rule is and how it is related to the other virtues. But this must be agreed upon beforehand, that the whole account of matters of conduct must be given in outline and not precisely. As we said at the very beginning, that the accounts we demand must be in accordance with the subject matter. Matters concerned with conduct and questions of what is good for us have no fixity, any more than matters of health. The general account being of this nature, the account of particular cases is yet more lacking in exactness. For they do not fall under any art or precept, but the agents themselves must in each case consider what is appropriate to the occasion, as happens also in the art of medicine or of navigation. But though our present account is of this nature, we must give what help we can. First, then, let us consider this, that it is the nature of such things to be destroyed by defect and excess, as we see in the case of strength and of health. For to gain light on things imperceptible, we must use the evidence of sensible things. Both excessive and defective exercise destroys the strength, and similarly, drink or food which is above or below a certain amount destroys the health, while that which is proportionate both produces and increases and preserves it. So too is it, then, in the case of temperance and courage and the other virtues. For the man who flies from and fears everything and does not stand his ground against anything becomes a coward, and the man who fears nothing at all, but goes to meet every danger, becomes rash. And similarly, the man who indulges in every pleasure and abstains from none becomes self-indulgent, while the man who shuns every pleasure, as boors do, becomes in a way insensible. Temperance and courage, then, are destroyed by excess and defect, and preserved by the mean. But not only are the sources and causes of their origination and growth the same as those of their destruction, but also the sphere of their actualization will be the same. For this is also true of the things which are more evident to sense, for example, of strength. It is produced by taking much food and undergoing much exertion, and it is the strong man that will be most able to do these things. So too is it with the virtues. By abstaining from pleasures we become temperate, and it is when we have become so that we are most able to abstain from them, and similarly too in the case of courage. For by being habituated to despise things that are terrible, and to stand our ground against them, we become brave. And it is when we have become so that we shall be most able to stand our ground against them. Section 3. We must take as a sign of states of character the pleasure or pain that ensues on acts. For the man who abstains from bodily pleasures and delights in this very fact is temperate, while the man who is annoyed at it is self-indulgent. And he who stands his ground against things that are terrible and delights in this, or at least is not pained, is brave, while the man who is pained is a coward. For moral excellence is concerned with pleasures and pains. It is on account of the pleasure that we do bad things, and on account of the pain that we abstain from noble ones. Hence we ought to have been brought up in a particular way from our very youth, as Plato says, so as both to delight in and to be pained by the things that we ought. For this is the right education. Again, if the virtues are concerned with actions and passions, and every passion and every action is accompanied by pleasure and pain, for this reason also virtue will be concerned with pleasures and pains. This is indicated also by the fact that punishment is inflicted by these means, for it is a kind of cure, and it is the nature of cures to be affected by contraries. Again, as we said but lately, every state of soul has a nature relative to and concerned with the kind of things by which it tends to be made better or worse. But it is by reason of pleasures and pains that men become bad, by pursuing and avoiding these. Either the pleasures and pains they ought not, or when they ought not, or as they ought not, or by going wrong in one of the other similar ways that may be distinguished. Hence men even define the virtues as certain states of impassivity and rest. Not well, however, because they speak absolutely, and do not say as one ought, and as one ought not, and when one ought or ought not, and the other things that may be added. We assume, then, that this kind of excellence tends to do what is best with regards to pleasures and pains, and vice does the contrary. The following facts also may show us that virtue and vice are concerned with these same things, there being 3 objects of choice and 3 of avoidance, the noble, the advantageous, the pleasant, and their contraries, the base, the injurious, the painful. About all of these, the good man tends to go right and the bad man to go wrong, and especially about pleasure, for this is common to the animals, and also it accompanies all objects of choice. For even the noble and the advantageous appear pleasant. Again, it has grown up with us all from our infancy. This is why it is difficult to rub off this passion, ingrained as it is in our life. And we measure even our actions, some of us more and others less, by the rule of pleasure and pain. For this reason, then, our whole inquiry must be about these, for to feel delight and pain rightly or wrongly has no small effect on our actions. Again, it is harder to fight with pleasure than with anger, to use Heraclitus' phrase. But both art and virtue are always concerned with what is harder, for even the good is better when it is harder. Therefore, for this reason also, the whole concern both of virtue and of political science is with pleasures and pains. For the man who uses these well will be good, he who uses them badly, bad. That virtue, then, is concerned with pleasures and pains, and that by the acts from which it arises it is both increased and, if they are done differently, destroyed, and that the acts from which it arose are those in which it actualizes itself. Let this be taken as said. Section 4. The question might be asked, what we mean by saying that we must become just by doing just acts, and temperate by doing temperate acts. For if men do just intemperate acts, they are already just and temperate. Exactly as, if they do what is in accordance with the laws of grammar and of music, they are grammarians and musicians. Or is this not true even of the arts? It is possible to do something that is in accordance with the laws of grammar, either by chance or at the suggestion of another. A man will be a grammarian, then, only when he has both done something grammatical and done it grammatically. And this means doing it in accordance with the grammatical knowledge in himself. Again, the case of the arts and that of the virtues are not similar. For the products of the arts have their goodness in themselves, so that it is enough that they should have a certain character. But if the acts that are in accordance with the virtues have themselves a certain character, it does not follow that they are done justly or temperately. The agent also must be in a certain condition when he does them. In the first place, he must have knowledge. Secondly, he must choose the acts, and choose them for their own sakes. And thirdly, his action must proceed from a firm and unchangeable character. These are not reckoned in as conditions of the possession of the arts, except the bare knowledge. But as a condition of the possession of the virtues, knowledge has little or no weight, while the other conditions count not for a little, but for everything. In other words, the very conditions which result from often doing just and temperate acts. Actions, then, are called just and temperate, when they are such as the just or the temperate man would do. But it is not the man who does these that is just and temperate, but the man who also does them as just and temperate men do them. It is well said, then, that it is by doing just acts that the just man is produced, and by doing temperate acts, the temperate man. Without doing these, no one would have even a prospect of becoming good. But most people do not do these, but take refuge in theory, and think they are being philosophers and will become good in this way, behaving somewhat like patients who listen attentively to their doctors, but do none of the things they are ordered to do. As the latter will not be made well in body by such a course of treatment, the former will not be made well in soul by such a course of philosophy. Section 5. Next, we must consider what virtue is. Since things that are found in the soul are of three kinds, passions, faculties, states of character, virtue must be one of these. By passions, I mean appetite, anger, fear, confidence, envy, joy, friendly feeling, hatred, longing, emulation, pity, and in general, the feelings that are accompanied by pleasure or pain. By faculties, the things in virtue of which we are said to be capable of feeling these. For example, of becoming angry, or being pained, or feeling pity. By states of character, the things in virtue of which we stand well or badly with reference to the passions. For example, with reference to anger, we stand badly if we feel it violently or too weakly, and well if we feel it moderately, and similarly with reference to the other passions. Now neither the virtues nor the vices are passions, because we are not called good or bad on the ground of our passions, but are so called on the ground of our virtues and our vices, and because we are neither praised nor blamed for our passions. For the man who feels fear or anger is not praised, nor is the man who simply feels anger blamed, but the man who feels it in a certain way. But for our virtues and our vices we are praised or blamed. Again, we feel anger and fear without choice, but the virtues are modes of choice, or involve choice. Further, in respect of the passions we are said to be moved, but in respect of the virtues and the vices, we are said not to be moved, but to be disposed in a particular way. For these reasons also, they are not faculties. For we are neither called good nor bad, nor praised nor blamed, for the simple capacity of feeling the passion. Again, we have the faculties by nature, but we are not made good or bad by nature. We have spoken of this before. If, then, the virtues are neither passions nor faculties, all that remains is that they should be states of character. Thus we have stated what virtue is in respect of its genus. Section 6. We must, however, not only describe virtue as a state of character, but also say what sort of state it is. We may remark, then, that every virtue or excellence both brings into good condition the thing of which it is the excellence, and makes the work of that thing be done well. For example, the excellence of the eye makes both the eye and its work good, for it is by the excellence of the eye that we see well. Similarly, the excellence of the horse makes a horse both good in itself, and good at running, and at carrying its rider, and at awaiting the attack of the enemy. Therefore, if this is true in every case, the virtue of man also will be the state of character, which makes a man good, and which makes him do his own work well. How this is to happen we have stated already, but it will be made plain also by the following consideration of the specific nature of virtue. In everything that is continuous and divisible, it is possible to take more, less, or an equal amount, and that either in terms of the thing itself or relatively to us. And the equal is an intermediate between excess and defect. By the intermediate in the object, I mean that which is equidistant from each of the extremes, which is one and the same for all men. By the intermediate, relatively to us, that which is neither too much nor too little, and this is not one nor the same for all. For instance, if 10 is many, and 2 is few, 6 is the intermediate, taken in terms of the object, for it exceeds and is exceeded by an equal amount. This is intermediate according to arithmetical proportion. But the intermediate relatively to us is not to be taken so. If 10 pounds are too much for a particular person to eat, and 2 too little, it does not follow that the trainer will order 6 pounds. For this is also perhaps too much for the person who is to take it, or too little. Too little for Milo, too much for the beginner in athletic exercises. The same is true of running and wrestling. Thus, a master of any art avoids excess and defect, but seeks the intermediate and chooses this. The intermediate not in the object, but relatively to us. If it is thus, then, that every art does its work well, by looking to the intermediate and judging its works by this standard, so that we often say of good works of art that it is not possible either to take away or to add anything, implying that excess and defect destroy the goodness of works of art, while the mean preserves it. And good artists, as we say, look to this in their work. And if, further, virtue is more exact and better than any art, as nature also is, then virtue must have the quality of aiming at the intermediate. I mean moral virtue, for it is this that is concerned with passions and action, and in these there is excess, defect, and the intermediate. For instance, both fear and confidence, and appetite and anger and pity, and in general pleasure and pain, may be felt both too much and too little, and in both cases not well. But to feel them at the right times, with reference to the right objects, towards the right people, with the right motive, and in the right way, is what is both intermediate and best, and this is characteristic of virtue. Similarly, with regard to actions, also there is excess, defect, and the intermediate. Now, virtue is concerned with passions and actions, in which excess is a form of failure, and so is defect, while the intermediate is praised and is a form of success. And being praised and being successful are both characteristics of virtue. Therefore, virtue is a kind of mean, since, as we have seen, it aims at what is intermediate. Again, it is possible to fail in many ways, for evil belongs to the class of the unlimited, as the Pythagoreans conjectured, and good to that of the limited. While to succeed is possible only in one way, for which reason also one is easy and the other difficult. To miss the mark easy, to hit it difficult. For these reasons also, then, excess and defect are characteristic of vice, and the mean of virtue. For men are good in but one way, but bad in many. Virtue, then, is a state of character concerned with choice, lying in a mean. In other words, the mean relative to us, this being determined by a rational principle, and by that principle by which the man of practical wisdom would determine it. Now it is a mean between two vices, that which depends on excess and that which depends on defect. And again, it is a mean because the vices, respectively, fall short of or exceed what is right in both passions and actions, while virtue both finds and chooses that which is intermediate. Hence, in respect of its substance and the definition which states its essence, virtue is a mean, with regard to what is best and right in extreme. But not every action nor every passion admits of a mean. For some have names that already imply badness. For example, spite, shamelessness, envy, and in the case of actions, adultery, theft, murder. For all of these and such like things imply by their names that they are themselves bad, and not the excesses or deficiencies of them. It is not possible then ever to be right with regard to them. One must always be wrong. Nor does goodness or badness with regard to such things depend on committing adultery with the right woman at the right time and in the right way, but simply to do any of them is to go wrong. It would be equally absurd, then, to expect that in unjust, cowardly, and voluptuous action there should be a mean, an excess, and a deficiency. For at that rate there would be a mean of excess and of deficiency, an excess of excess, and a deficiency of deficiency. But as there is no excess and deficiency of temperance and courage, because what is intermediate is in a sense an extreme, so too of the actions we have mentioned there is no mean nor any excess and deficiency. But however they are done, they are wrong. For in general there is neither a mean of excess and deficiency, nor excess and deficiency of a mean. Section 7. We must, however, not only make this general statement, but also apply it to the individual facts. For among statements about conduct, those which are general apply more widely, but those which are particular are more genuine, since conduct has to do with individual cases, and our statements must harmonize with the facts in these cases. We may take these cases from our table. With regard to feelings of fear and confidence, courage is the mean. Of the people who exceed, he who exceeds in fearlessness has no name. Many of the states have no name. While the man who exceeds in confidence is rash, and he who exceeds in fear and falls short in confidence is a coward. With regards to pleasures and pain, not all of them, and not so much with regard to the pains. The mean is temperance, the excess self-indulgence. Persons deficient with regard to the pleasures are not often found. Hence such persons also have received no name. But let us call them insensible. With regard to giving and taking of money, the mean is liberality. The excess and defect, prodigality and meanness. In these actions, people exceed and fall short in contrary ways. The prodigal exceeds in spending and falls short in taking, while the mean man exceeds in taking and falls short in spending. At present, we are giving a mere outline or summary, and are satisfied with this. Later, these states will be more exactly determined. With regard to money, there are also other dispositions. A mean magnificence. For the magnificent man differs from the liberal man. The former deals with large sums, the latter with small ones. In excess, tastelessness and vulgarity, and a deficiency, niggardliness. These differ from the states opposed to liberality, and the mode of their difference will be stated later. With regard to honor and dishonor, the mean is proper pride, the excess is known as a sort of empty vanity, and the deficiency is undue humility. And as we said, liberality was related to magnificence, differing from it by dealing with small sums. So there is a state similarly related to proper pride, being concerned with small honors, while that is concerned with great. For it is possible to desire honor as one ought, and more than one ought, and less. And the man who exceeds in his desires is called ambitious, the man who falls short unambitious, while the intermediate person has no name. The dispositions also are nameless, except that of the ambitious man is called ambition. Hence the people who are at the extremes lay claim to the middle place. And we ourselves sometimes call the intermediate person ambitious and sometimes unambitious, and sometimes praise the ambitious man and sometimes the unambitious. The reason of our doing this will be stated in what follows. But now let us speak of the remaining states according to the method which has been indicated. With regard to anger also, there is an excess, a deficiency, and a mean. Although they can scarcely be said to have names, yet since we call the intermediate person good-tempered, let us call the mean good temper. Of the persons at the extremes, let the one who exceeds be called irascible, and his vice irascibility, and the man who falls short in inirascible sort of person, and the deficiency inirascibility. There are also 3 other means, which have a certain likeness to one another, but differ from one another. For they are all concerned with intercourse in words and action, but differ in that one is concerned with truth in this sphere, the other 2 with pleasantness, and of this one kind is exhibited in giving amusement, the other in all the circumstances of life. We must therefore speak of these 2, that we may the better see that in all things the mean is praiseworthy, in the extremes neither praiseworthy nor right, but worthy of blame. Now most of these states also have no names, but we must try, as in the other cases, to invent names ourselves, that we may be clear and easy to follow. With regard to truth, then, the intermediate is a truthful sort of person, and the mean may be called truthfulness, while the pretense which exaggerates is boastfulness, and the person characterized by it is a boaster. And that which understates is mock modesty, and the person characterized by it mock modest. With regard to pleasantness, in the giving of amusement, the intermediate person is ready-witted, and the disposition ready-wit. The excess is buffoonery, and the person characterized by it a buffoon, while the man who falls short is a sort of boor, and his state is boorishness. With regard to the remaining kind of pleasantness, that which is exhibited in life in general, the man who is pleasant in the right way is friendly, and the mean is friendliness, while the man who exceeds is an obsequious person if he has no end in view, a flatterer if he is aiming at his own advantage, and the man who falls short and is unpleasant in all circumstances is a quarrelsome and surly sort of person. There are also means in the passions and concerned with the passions, since shame is not a virtue, and yet praise is extended to the modest man. For even in these matters, one man is said to be intermediate and another to exceed, as for instance the bashful man who is ashamed of everything, while he who falls short or is not ashamed of anything at all is shameless, and the intermediate person is modest. Righteous indignation is a mean between envy and spite, and these states are concerned with the pain and pleasure that are felt at the fortunes of our neighbors. The man who is characterized by righteous indignation is pained at undeserved good fortune. The envious man, going beyond him, is pained at all good fortune, and the spiteful man falls so far short of being pained that he even rejoices. But these states there will be an opportunity of describing elsewhere. With regard to justice, since it has not one simple meaning, we shall, after describing the other states, distinguish its 2 kinds and say how each of them is a mean. And similarly, we shall treat also of the rational virtues. There are 3 kinds of disposition, then, 2 of them vices, involving excess and deficiency respectively, and 1 a virtue, vis-a-vis the mean, and all are in a sense opposed to all. For the extreme states are contrary both to the intermediate state and to each other, and the intermediate to the extremes, as the equal is greater relatively to the less, less relatively to the greater. So the middle states are excessive relatively to the deficiencies, deficient relatively to the excesses, both in passions and in action. For the brave man appears rash relatively to the coward, and cowardly relatively to the rash man. And similarly, the temperate man appears self-indulgent relatively to the insensible man, insensible relatively to the self-indulgent, and the liberal man prodigal relatively to the mean man, mean relatively to the prodigal. Hence also the people at the extremes push the intermediate man each over to the other, and the brave man is called rash by the coward, cowardly by the rash man, and correspondingly in the other cases. These states being thus opposed to one another, the greatest contrariety is that of the extremes to each other, rather than to the intermediate. For these are further from each other than from the intermediate, as the great is further from the small, and the small from the great than both are from the equal. Again, to the intermediate some extremes show a certain likeness, as that of rashness to courage, and that of prodigality to liberality. But the extremes show the greatest unlikeness to each other. Now contraries are defined as the things that are furthest from each other, so that things that are further apart are more contrary. To the mean, in some cases, the deficiency, in some the excess is more opposed. For example, it is not rashness, which is an excess, but cowardice, which is a deficiency, that is more opposed to courage, and not insensibility, which is a deficiency, but self-indulgence, which is an excess, that is more opposed to temperance. This happens from two reasons, one being drawn from the thing itself. For because one extreme is nearer and liker to the intermediate, we oppose not this, but rather its contrary to the intermediate. For example, since rashness is thought liker and nearer to courage, and cowardice more unlike, we oppose rather the latter to courage. For things that are further from the intermediate are thought more contrary to it. This then is one cause, drawn from the thing itself. Another is drawn from ourselves. For the things to which we ourselves more naturally tend seem more contrary to the intermediate. For instance, we ourselves tend more naturally to pleasures, and hence are more easily carried away towards self-indulgence than towards propriety. We describe as contrary to the mean, then, rather the directions in which we more often go to great lengths, and therefore self-indulgence, which is in excess, is the more contrary to temperance. Section 9. That moral virtue is a mean, then, and in what sense it is so, and that it is a mean between two vices, the one involving excess, the other deficiency, and that it is such because its character is to aim at what is intermediate in passions and in actions, has been sufficiently stated. Hence also it is no easy task to be good, for in everything it is no easy task to find the middle. For example, to find the middle of a circle is not for everyone, but for him who knows. So too, any one can get angry. That is easy, or give or spend money, but to do this to the right person, to the right extent, at the right time, with the right motive, and in the right way, that is not for everyone, nor is it easy. Wherefore, goodness is both rare and laudable and noble. Hence, he who aims at the intermediate must first depart from what is the more contrary to it, as Calypso advises. Hold the ship out beyond that surf and spray. For of the extremes, one is more erroneous, one less so. Therefore, since to hit the mean is hard in the extreme, we must as a second best, as people say, take the least of the evils, and this will be done best in the way we describe. But we must consider the things towards which we ourselves also are easily carried away. For some of us tend to one thing, some to another, and this will be recognizable from the pleasure and the pain we feel. We must drag ourselves away to the contrary extreme, for we shall get into the intermediate state by drawing well away from error, as people do in straightening sticks that are bent. Now, in everything, the pleasant or pleasure is most to be guarded against, for we do not judge it impartially. We ought, then, to feel towards pleasure as the elders of the people felt towards Helen, and in all circumstances repeat their saying, for if we dismiss pleasure, thus we are less likely to go astray. It is by doing this, then, to sum the matter up, that we shall best be able to hit the mean. But this is no doubt difficult, and especially in individual cases. For it is not easy to determine both how and with whom and on what provocation and how long one should be angry. For we too sometimes praise those who fall short and call them good-tempered, but sometimes we praise those who get angry and call them manly. The man, however, who deviates little from goodness is not blamed, whether he does so in the direction of the more or of the less, but only the man who deviates more widely, for he does not fail to be noticed. But up to what point and to what extent a man must deviate before he becomes blameworthy, it is not easy to determine by reasoning, any more than anything else that is perceived by the senses. Such things depend on particular facts, and the decision rests with perception. So much, then, is plain that the intermediate state is in all things to be praised, but that we must incline sometimes towards the excess, sometimes towards the deficiency, for so shall we most easily hit the mean and what is right.